Hey, welcome to the Tape to Tape podcast powered by the Ram 1500 Sport, built exclusively for Canadians. All right, Rory, big sports questions for you here to kick off the pod.
Let's do it.
Who's going to win the World Series? That starts tonight, Tuesday, the day we're actually taping this.
That's a tough question.
You're just happy the Yankees are out?
I'm just really happy the Yankees are out at this point. It's really hard to pick against the Houston Astros, isn't it? I mean, they just seem to have everything. They have defense, they have hitting, they have a lot of pitching. I guess that can be said for both sides, but the Astros just seem to have it all. I don't even know if they have a weakness.
I'm going with a heart pick. I'm picking the Nationals. I would just like to see it. But I do believe a little bit in the delay hurting the Magic a little bit. Yeah. They've been off for a while, but hey, man, they got Strasburg. They got Scherzer. Yeah. I think you're in the game.
It's been a long time, but how do you think Montreal Expos fans would feel about the Nationals winning a World Series?
I think okay. I feel like the Expos feel like they had, I don't know how much of a connection people feel to the team, but I don't think it would be like
it's not their
Colorado
players
winning the Stanley Cup the first year after they left Quebec.
That
certainly
sting.
Wouldn't be that.
Yeah.
All right, the Raptors start tonight. Are they going to make the playoffs?
Yes. Yeah, I feel like they're going to.
I think they will make the playoffs too.
Fifth, sixth, something like that.
Scrappy. Fun season.
Yep.
Spicy P. Should we talk a little hockey?
Let's do hockey. This is a hockey podcast.
Do you know what the Colorado Avalanche's winning percentage was in the 16-17 season?
So that was the disastrous season. You mean season-long winning percentage?
Season-long winning percentage.
Oh, boy. I don't know.
It was a
250.
It was 293. 293. It would not have won you the batting title.
Right.
And Jared Bednar becomes the coach. The team basically had made the playoffs once between, since in the decade, basically. It was the Patrick Waugh shortened season, 2013, which has become the case study for analytics in terms of here's how you know something's actually wrong with the team and it's not sustainable.
100%.
Bednar's the coach. I feel like there's people working NHL beats who you could have fooled with, hey, do you know who the coach of Colorado Avalanche is?
Yep.
And all that's the backdrop when they're trying to trade Matt Duchene and the situation drags on and on. I bring this all up for a few reasons, but we're basically at the 2-year anniversary of the Duchene trade. It was November 5th, 2017. Mm-hmm. And I'll tell you what, and you can call up the tape from this podcast. We like to trade for everyone that day, and most people like to trade for everyone, Nashville, Colorado, and Ottawa. Yep. But ever since that happened, it's just crazy how our perception of the Avs has completely flipped from you're kind of looking at Joe Sakic, and I don't want to say he was in that territory where he's tarnishing his reputation as a player, but you really didn't know if this guy should be in charge of an NHL team at that point. There was not a lot to suggest he should.
Yeah.
And 2 years later, it's just hit after hit for this team. And they come into this year with all this hoopla, and so far, they're really living up to it. And it's not just the top line. They went out and got Kadri.
Who's been great.
Tyson Jost, third-line center. P.S., a 10th overall pick from not that long ago, scored a hat trick in a win over Tampa Bay. You're starting to look at that thinking, well, that guy can probably bring what Kerfoot brought, pretty soon.
Yep.
Cale Makar, it's one of those face smacks you do when you realize, why didn't I pick that guy for the Calder instead of just picking the first overall guy?
Right.
We don't know the extent of Rantanen's injury right now. He turned an ankle or at least that's what we saw. It didn't look great.
Didn't really want to watch that video.
Yeah, there was certainly some stills that didn't look fantastic, but even Colorado's at the point now where even if their hot shot top line right winger goes down, maybe left winger, I might have that wrong, might have that flipped. If he goes down for 2 months, this team's just going to keep clipping, and they're kind of at that point already where you're thinking, well, the playoffs is the real season for them. Let's see what they can do because they might be able to go all the way.
Yeah, you kind of touched on how the perception of the team has changed in 2 years. I was going to say the perception of the GM has completely changed.
Oh, absolutely.
He was I remember how long it seemed like Duchesne had to be traded for, and then that famous picture of him arriving at training camp looking like, I really don't want to
anywhere
be
but here.
Yeah, and
you were like, how's he going to get anything for this guy who clearly
you waited too long, you missed your window. Now, if you trade him in season, you're not going to get what you want, and if you play through the whole season with them, then you're in for another terrible year again where no one's happy. And he ends up cranking a home run. The pickups the pickups this summer, Jonas Donskoy's got 6 points in 9 games. YouTube producer, Colorado Avalanche fan extraordinaire, Drew Livingston will not let me forget about Andrei Burakovsky, who I'm still not really buying into, but he's scored a couple of game-winning goals for the team so far, and he's been looking good. I wonder if Rantanen is out for a while, if Landeskog and McKinnon stay together, if they split them up, because they've done that in the past too, or how those lines. But now this year, what they didn't have last year, and they were still a pretty good team last year, is they now have the depth and the options to move guys around and try and find that best fit when injuries ultimately do hit. And like you said, like the defense is great. Philip Grubauer has been really solid in net, but his backup, Pavel Francouz, who was on pretty much nobody's radar, but had a pretty good track record in the KHL, a couple good years there. He's been amazing coming in. So if he can keep something to that level up, and you can lower Grubauer's starts, as we know, we've talked about this so many times, that you want to keep a starter below 50 games ideally, so he's rested for the playoffs. You could potentially do that without sacrificing anything. So, I mean, last season we saw them take a step forward in how cohesive they were and how they were being led by their big dogs, and that they were real. McKinnon wasn't just a one-year wonder. He was going to stick and be that kind of a stud. And this year, with Kadri on that second line, Jost, with the young defense coming up too, now they have the depth that they didn't have before, and that's what really separates the really good teams from the ones that can be good for stretches but can't really survive when injuries or slumps start to hit and they start to peter out.
Would you call the Mighty Ducks the Mighty? I actually didn't do that on purpose. That was just a slip. Would you call the Ducks, who are mighty, an adopted team of yours?
I think so. Yeah, for sure. I like watching them play. I've always liked watching the Ducks play. It's sometimes hard to do it on the East Coast.
It's true.
I wish I was a fan of sports living on the West Coast.
I know.
Seems really wonderful.
I hear the Bill Simmons podcast when he talks about waking up and watching football from 10 o'clock on a Sunday, and it's
amazing. That's amazing. But they're a fun team to watch. But the thing with the Ducks is historically they've always been like a big team, right? Getzlaf and Perry were the big guys down low, and they could really play a good cycle game and beat you that way. This team's a little bit different. They still have Getzlaf, obviously, but they're quicker. They play with a lot more pace, and you're seeing some of the young kids like Sam Steele start to show something here at the start of the season. The guys that we recognize as bounce back candidates, Ricard Raquel had a really low shooting percentage last year. He's been lights out at the start of this season. Jacob Silverberg, another guy, he's been good. My boy, Andre Kasha, has been really good. Like all these guys, you saw that there was more to them than what there was last year. And last year I was wondering if it was a case of, they weren't deep enough. The kids weren't ready yet to push for higher spots, more responsibility, but also were they just had Randy Carlyle worn out his welcome, right? Coaches have shelf lives, and then the rooms start to tune them out.
Sure.
And so I think there was a little bit of that going on there as well. And you just needed to get out of that fog, start something new with Dallas Eakins, who himself really learns a lot by coaching unsuccessfully with the Edmonton Oilers, so he's changed his approach, and the team just seems to have a lot new life to it. The defense, the blue line, is way better than it was last year. Cam Fowler has been fabulous this year. Lindholm has been great. I mean, it's always been a strength of theirs, but again, for whatever reason, last year there was just nothing exciting going on there. And then, of course, in net, I don't know if there's a better backup. Definitely not a more experienced, stable backup in the league than Ryan Miller is. And we've talked about it so many times that John Gibson's got to be a Vezina finalist sometime soon.
It's coming.
This really seems like the year. It's always injuries kind of hold this guy back. But again, 2 of the finalists last year got no more than 47 starts. So that, as long as he gets there, John Gibson should have been a finalist at some point. He should have been a finalist by now. This seems to be the year that he can really step forward. Now, there is one thing about the Ducks, PDO, which is that stat that is basically tracking who's been super lucky and who's been very unlucky. The Ducks are one of those teams that have been very, very lucky. The silver lining is that
save percentage probably isn't
save
gonna come
percentage
down,
is
yeah.
pushing that. The shooting percentage isn't like extremely
Crazy.
high and destined to come down. The save percentage is so high that it is going to come down some, but not to the degree that it's going to adversely affect this team. It's reasonable to expect that this team with Miller and Gibson could end up after 82 games with the best team percentage.
Sure, absolutely. Well, stick around, sports fans. We're going to talk a lot more hockey here. We're going to bring Eric Engels in to talk about the Habs. Been a decent start to the year for Montreal, but as always, a lot of questions around that team. We're also going to talk a little fantasy in the next segment, and Rory and I are facing each other head to head in one of our pools. So hopefully, we're still talking to each other next week. Stick around. More coming up on Tape to Tape. Welcome back to Tape to Tape. Time to talk a little fantasy, Rory, as we go head to head in our pool here.
Yep.
If you are into fantasy sports, if you're into fantasy hockey, make sure you check out the Sportsnet fantasy pool presented by RAM. Go to sportsnet.ca/RAM for your chance to win all kinds of cool prizes, including a RAM 1500 Sport. So, Rory, we're going head to head, but it's early days. We don't really know how these things are going to play out. But in our other pool, the action's already heating up trade-wise. I know you're jumping in. You're trying to make strong moves here for your rebuild.
Yeah, so a little background here. We're expansion teams in this draft. It's a long-running league, at least 10 years, I think. So not starting from a position of strength. The guy in first place has like McDavid, Draisaitl, Marchand. Like it's
I don't know how it
team,
happened.
right?
Yeah.
So we're not winning
That's
anytime
right.
soon. So I've actually had this trade offer on the table for a while, and I finally accepted it, giving up my Chris Letang, who's been fabulous and great, and this is why the first place guy wants him, I guess, but I'm kind of thinking he's going to get hurt because he probably averages 60, 65 games a year. And knowing that I'm going to be in this for the long run and doing a rebuild, I was able to get Oliver Wahlstrom, Raphael Lavoie, and Ottawa Senators 21-year-old goalie Philip Gustafsson, which is a really long-term
Taking
play. You
a
never
flyer.
know with goalies, right? But it's all about Wahlstrom, who has already played a couple of NHL games this year, started very strongly in the AHL this year before that. Obviously, very highly touted draft pick, great career at the U.S. National Team Development Program. And Lavoie, I'm iffy on, but he's definitely got that natural goal-scoring ability, which sometimes just naturally translates into stardom at the NHL level, right? And right now, he's crushing QMJHL competition as a 19-year-old, so that's a good sign. It's not something that I'm going to say makes him a guarantee to hit in the NHL or anything like that, but hopefully he pays off. For me, though, it was all about Wahlstrom. I was waffling on this a little bit, trying to get some other guys to make some trades, and nothing was moving, so I'm not winning. I might as well try and go get Wahlstrom while I can.
Nice. I got people asking me about Dougie Hamilton. You look at the way he started the year. I mean, let's zoom out. Look at the way John Carlson started the year. Insane. Yes. But Dougie Hamilton, for a guy we've talked about a lot because he's been traded twice. Mm-hmm. We heard Jake Gardner talk about wanting to go to a place like Carolina where it's a little quieter. It sure seems like that suits Dougie Hamilton now.
Yes.
This guy's going to be, I would have to think, getting on the short list of Norris candidates here this year.
The thing about him, and you could see it coming, is that his dip in numbers last year, you can throw that out the window because that's not indicative of how they're going to use him going forward. Once Justin Falk moved out, that opened up a whole bunch of power play, a whole bunch more minutes for Dougie Hamilton. He was the one who was going to take that over. That's what he got in Calgary when he had a good year there, right? So it was just a matter of getting that role and responsibility back, and he has it now. His talent is undeniable. He's going to be there for the long term, I would think. So going in, just forget about last year. He's going to be a stud for the those guys for a long time to come. That would be a tough one to trade. That might be good for a rebuilding team.
It might be.
Onto that
all right. Yeah, now you say that. I got an offer out there twisting in the wind. We'll see what happens. Ask for the moon and see what happens. All right, Carolina was one of those teams that narrowly edged the Montreal Canadiens in the playoff race. Last year ended up going to the Final Four. We're going to talk about those very same Montreal Canadiens with Eric Engels, our man on the ground in Montreal. So stick around for that. Coming up on the other side of the break, Mr. Engels live from Montreal. Welcome back to Tape. Time now for our overtime segment brought to you by Subway. No joke. Subway now delivers. Joining us on the line now from Montreal, partway through a Paul Byron column, it is Sportsnet's Eric Engels. Eric, how you doing?
I'm doing really well, guys. How are you?
We're all right. I don't know if we'll get to Lord Byron today in our Habs chat, but I do want to talk to you about a few things. The power play, which people were screaming about all of last year and hand-wringing over the summer. It looks great so far. The penalty kill so far, though, the exact opposite, near the bottom of the league. So tell us a bit about what's worked with the power play, but maybe zone in on why is the PK not working and the defensive game in general for the Habs not real crisp right now.
Yeah, well, let's change it up. Let's start with the good and then finish with the bad. The good with the power play is, and what I gleaned from it is the way the coaches have kind of structured things around the personnel that they have. And I was talking to Thomas Tatar last week, who said, we don't have Stamkos and Kucherov across from each other ripping one-timers. So, the Canadians seem to have emphasized working the play down low a lot more than they did last year. It's opening up the points for the plays that they want to make with guys like Weber and Petrie shooting one-timers. They have much more net presence. They've got 2 or 3 guys around the net, so they're not one-and-done opportunities. And probably one of the biggest factors in their success so far is that there wasn't a lot of turnover on the team from last year to this year, and there's a familiarity factor that has established itself, and chemistry is kind of there. Whereas last year, it was a snowball effect where they started out the gate with issues and never really figured it out. And, I was talking to Kirk Muller before the season began. He said one of the biggest problems they had is that Domi had a 5-game suspension in the preseason, and, they weren't able to structure their power play with him involved in game situations. And once you get going in one direction, it's hard to stop that snowball, which brings us to the penalty kill, which, for a couple of games seemed to have righted itself last week when, with the win over St. Louis, they were very strong on Saturday, and then Sunday the same problems are there. They're allowing too many seam passes. I think speaking of Jeff Petrie, who's a key part of their penalty kill, he talked about the fact that when you're allowing those team passes and allowing the guys that the other team wants to set up for one-timers to get clean looks, it's because you're being too aggressive. It's because you're getting outside your box. You're running around a little too much, and that's how somebody finds themselves open, especially somebody who, the other team is trying to set up that shot for. So, they have to trust each other. They have to trust themselves in their own roles, and it should get sorted out because, you look at Claude Julien's track record. He's always been a guy who's done a great job with penalty killing on his teams, and to have Luke Richards in there running that aspect of the game for the Canadiens, I think they will figure that out.
So let me talk about the defense in general a bit here. Cale Fleury makes the team out of training camp. He was scratched a couple times, made his way back in the lineup. They've had kind of a rotating cast with Christian Folin, Mike Riley coming in, Ben Sherratt dropped down to the third pair. Clearly, they're still sort of figuring things out back there. When the dust settles, do you think they have enough back there, or do you think this is a place where we could still see a move, maybe even before Christmas kind of thing?
Yeah, I doubt it's much of a maybe scenario, to be honest with you. Marc Bergevin was pretty open about the fact that he chased Jake Gardiner on the open market in the summer. Wasn't able to convince him to come to Montreal, and understandably, I think Gardiner himself, if he was going to leave a market like Toronto, it wasn't going to be for a market like Toronto, like Montreal, given everything he went through in Toronto with the fans there and how hard they were on him. This is a scenario that Claude Julien was talking about a week ago, and he was asked about whether or not they have the ideal partner for Shea Weber, and his answer was, I work with what I have. It's a work in progress. Shea Weber himself and Victor Mete as a pairing, they've been good in parts of the game. They've been not so good in other parts, and they're still figuring it out despite spending 2 years together on a pairing, or the majority of 2 years together when Weber wasn't hurt. They have chemistry there. They haven't played their best hockey together. I expect that things tighten up around the league in general. That's going to help a player like Weber, and I think Mete has shown some bursts over the last week that, he's starting to elevate his game. People forget how long it takes to get going for some players sometimes, and especially as you get older. I think it would be hyperbolic to start talking about, Weber's done and he's lost a step and he can't do it. This is a guy that over the last 3 years, when you look at the advanced stats in terms of what he does in not allowing passes to get to the spot in the dangerous areas, something that he hasn't been good at through the first 9 games of the season, I think that's going to correct itself, especially as the game tightens up, as teams get more and more familiar with each other and their systems and the way they need to play to win. We see it, every year everybody overreacts to the amount of goals that go in at the beginning of the season. Canadians have allowed 29 in 9 games. It's not a good statistic, obviously. They've also scored, the 4th most goals in the league, and we know that if there's going to be a correction on one side, there's probably going to be a correction on the other. So I expect this team can tighten up defensively. They have the parts to do it. Can they improve? I think so. In terms of bringing in somebody from the outside, it's something that they're going to be looking at throughout the season. Whether or not Marc Bergevin is willing to pull the trigger on a deal that has him send a future asset, one of their top prospects, who he's worked so hard in building up that prospect pool, is really it's really something you have to wonder about, because will the pressure of making the playoffs, and not missing them for a 4th time in 5 years, force him to do something that he doesn't necessarily want to do? It's something that we're going to keep an eye on from here to the end of the season.
So let's move up to the forwards, Eric. And Max Pacioretty's off to a great start in Vegas this year, 10 points in 10 games. And any time that he's going to go on a stretch of great play like that, Habs fans are going to be looking at, what's Nick Suzuki doing? And he had a really good preseason for the Habs, just a huge standout. Didn't come as quickly to him once the season started, but he got 2 goals in his last 3 games. What have you seen from him to start the season, and how he's adapting to actual real NHL regular season games?
I think experience is the best teacher, Rory. Here's a kid that in preseason and training camp showed exactly that main asset that had him become such a highly touted prospect. His brain for the game is tremendous. You watch him, if you isolate on him away from the puck and where he's going and what he's doing, he knows where to be at all times. And that's a huge asset, especially for a player that doesn't necessarily have that explosive stride yet. He's a really good skater. I don't want people to get me wrong. He just, at 20 years old, doesn't have that full strength yet to have that explosion, those first couple of steps. So knowing where to be and being in the right places is a major advantage, especially for a player like that. I think it was an adjustment for him to get onto the wing. I know he played a lot there in junior, but he, to me, is a natural centerman. He thinks the game like a centerman. He plays the game like a centerman. And given what I just talked about, having that kind of not having that explosive stride to start, being stuck on the wing and doing a lot more starting and stopping definitely was an adjustment for him at the beginning of the year. Then all of a sudden the puck goes in, a shoveled backhand by the net and a power play, kind of an easy goal for him, and the weight of the world comes off his shoulders and the confidence swells. And since he scored in that game against, I believe it was Minnesota last week, a 4-0 win, the couple games he's played since then, you could see a much more confident player, a player who's doing the things that he did at the junior level and dominating with. So that's been encouraging. You throw that in, versus Pacioretty with what Tatar did last year and where he's starting to find his game. It was a good trade, a trade that Vegas obviously felt they needed to make. But also a really good trade for Montreal. I think a winning trade for Montreal, both in the short term and the long term. And big part of the reason is because what what the Canadiens are going to get out of Nick Suzuki, I think, is a player that's going to have a very long NHL career.
And let's talk about another forward who there was a lot of attention around him in the preseason as well, but for very different reasons. Jonathan Drouin was struggling. There were trade rumors, suggestions coming out of that, and he's been great to start the season. Are they still figuring out where he fits in the lineup, who he plays best with, and like, is this real? Is he really finding himself as an NHL player? Are we going to see a step up from Drouin this season?
Well, what we're seeing is something really consistent. It's not just that he's got a point a game, it's that he scored an 8 of 9, and he's playing on a line with Jesperi Kotkaniemi and a rotating winger at this point because Joel Armia went down with an injury over the weekend. But there's a lot to like about the way Jonathan Drouin is playing the game. And, I think, it's always going to be a story whether or not he's producing. But the biggest thing, and certainly of notice to Canadiens fans, is the effort level. And the effort level has been very consistent. And the way he's working to get the puck back on his stick, the way he's working to create turnovers, the way he's working on a forecheck in his own zone. He's not perfect. He never will be. There will always be a couple of issues in his game, just like anybody else's. But I think it's interesting. In preseason, there was obviously a lot of negative attention there, and I was certainly. I don't want to put myself in the story here, but at the center of it, I wrote something. It was highly critical. I reported that the Canadiens, were exploring what the market might be on him. That potentially, if they couldn't find a fit for him in their lineup where they hadn't really found one, that they could be looking at an addition by subtraction type of situation, which is definitely not what you want to hear as a player. Mm-hmm. Definitely ruffled a lot of feathers. I don't think the Canadiens were happy about it. I don't think Jonathan Drouin was happy about it. I don't think his agent was happy about it. But at the end of the day, when I look back at that scenario, I don't know that it was necessarily a bad thing for him. And, I'm not taking any credit at all. I don't want anybody to get it wrong. I'm not taking credit for this drastic kind of turnaround that we've seen at the beginning of the year. But one of the things, because, what I wrote is not the only thing that was written about Drouin, is that the conversation started to get pretty intense around his play in the preseason, with him not scoring, with him playing in 4 of the first 6 games, which is very rare for a player with over 300 games of experience under his belt, with the general manager saying they expect more. What happened was this conversation really started to pick up steam, and the Canadiens had to kind of come out and put out the fire. But in behind closed doors, I think it opened up the lines of communication between Julien, Bergevin, Drouin, to give him a vote of confidence behind closed doors, to say, we believe in you. We understand that this is a frustrating process right now, but it's time to go out and show what you're capable of. And, I think for him personally, he kind of took it as a me against the world situation and turned something really positive out of it. Now what needs to be seen is that he will remain consistent, and not necessarily in his production, but in his effort from here to game 82. And if he can do that, he's really turned the corner. And if he can do that, it's a huge asset for the Montreal Canadiens, who many of the players in that room believe he's the best player on the team.
Well, if you're in any way responsible for him turning around, you'll never have to buy a drink again in that town.
Well, let's just say he's not so mad at me.
All right, so apologies in advance. I'll kind of fumble my way through this last one because I'm not even 100% sure what I'm asking. But you referenced, Eric, the Canadiens have missed the playoffs 4 out of the past 5 years, as you said. And I'm just curious what your feel is for, I guess, the feeling around the team, in that they're in this unique position where they've really kind of done a quick rebuild on the fly, or quick acquisition of a lot of assets. Their past 2 drafts have aged really well. They brought in Nick Suzuki. They all of a sudden have gone from a prospect cupboard that was pretty bereft to one that's, probably, top 5, top 8 in the NHL. Now, that said, Marc Bergevin has been the GM since 2012, and if they miss the playoffs again, you would think to some degree it's a no-brainer that someone else would come in and try and get things turned around. Do you feel like there's that, sort of sword dangling over everything, or do you think ownership is more micro-focused on, look, The guy's been here almost a decade now, but it's really been only the past 2 or 3 years when we've seen some of his best work, and we truly feel we are pointed in the right direction. So we're going to still show a little bit of patience here as we try to get to where we want to go.
Yeah, I think if anything, Jeff Molson, his owner, has really shown that he trusts Marc Bergevin. And, if we were going to discuss a time where he might lose his job, it would have been after that horror show 2017-18 season where the team finished, bottomed out. And he made a bunch of moves that just seemed to put them in that position. Once Jeff Molson gave him his endorsement at that point, I think Bergevin was really put in a position to succeed because there was only one direction to go in for this team, and that was to continue to build through the draft and build up the prospect pool, which I think if you ask the guys who do, draft work and guys who do prospect work across the league, people that are much more informed on that level than I am being on the Canadiens beat, they'll tell you that the Canadiens have one of the 5 best prospect pools in hockey, if not rank them higher. And So I think, to think that missing the playoffs this year would cost Marc Bergevin his job, I don't really believe that's the case. Now, if they stink and they miss the playoffs and they're in the bottom third of the league, I think it could. But, the more interesting part of the conversation for me in the playoff window is really about what this team believes it's able to accomplish. And, I spent a fair portion of preseason asking just about every player and every person in the organization how close they believe they are to being able to compete for the Stanley Cup, or more to the point, to give me a reason they believe they can win a Stanley Cup this year. And a lot of the times the answer I got was something external. It was, look at what the Blues did last year, or if you look at the playoffs and the way the league is set up, anybody can win. What I want to hear is things move along. Especially from players like Carey Price and Shea Weber and the older established players on the Montreal Canadiens, is they start to look at internal reasons for why they can win. And once you start to have that happen, that's when you've really taken a step forward. And I think this team is young. I think they learned a lot last year, and the fact that they didn't have much turnover in the offseason puts them on a path to act on those learnings this year. So far, it's been up and down. It's been 50-50. It's been pretty much 500. But I think they're capable of more, and I expect that we'll see it as we move forward here.
All right. Well, we will see where it goes from the team that missed the playoffs, was the best team to miss the playoffs, basically. Last year finished with more points than some of the teams that got in the West, but wasn't good enough to get in the tight East. Certainly a lot of intrigue, as always, around the Habs. Eric, thanks so much for joining us, pal.
Thanks for having me. Always a pleasure, guys.
All right, that is Sportsnet's Eric Engels. You can read his piece on Paul Byron very soon on sportsnet.ca and all his great Habs coverage. What he didn't mention, Rory, was that I texted him on the weekend and threw out the old who says no.
Oh, the fake trade.
They played Minnesota twice in a couple days, or at least in the span of a week.
Yep.
They beat them at home and ended up gagging up a game in Minnesota. But the old wheels got turning there because, as we talked about, the Canadiens are building, but they also clearly would like to win now, would like to get in the playoffs. They have a very specific need on the left side of their defense. And I wondered if the cratering Minnesota Wild with a new GM and Ryan Suter on a big contract that takes them to about 39. The Habs with a lot of draft picks and some cap space. Old buddy Shea Weber on the team. I wondered if maybe there was a fit there.
It'd be tough to fit under the cap.
It would be tough to $7 million, 7 and change. But they could do it, and it'd be a situation where you'd bring in a guy like that and kind of, I think he's the kind of player who probably will age okay, and you're hoping to not ask the world out of him as Victor Mete, Romanov down the road. You're hoping to, you're buying time for those guys to take the lead roles. Eric was lukewarm to the idea. Wasn't sure I had struck gold there, but
would you play him on the same pair? Or
I think you'd have to, just for old time's sake, a little bit. I mean, you probably would start that way, but I think ideally, the Canadiens would, in a perfect world, probably like to be reducing the amount of time Shea Weber's playing, right? I mean, I certainly don't think it'd be in your best interest to pretend it was Nashville 2011, right?
And you know who would be a great candidate to earn more minutes and soften Shea Weber's load is the minute eater Ryan Suter.
Yeah, exactly.
Constantly is up near the top of the league in average ice time.
Well, it'll be interesting to see what happens on the Dean. He mentioned Jake Gardner. Sure sounds like they took a run at him in the summer, but as Eric said, if you're Jake Gardner, you just came out of the zoo that is Toronto. Do you really want to go to possibly the one place that's even nuttier?
Yes.
Maybe not.
Speaking of the Minnesota Wild, while you mentioned them there, I'm going to promote another article that's going to be up on sportsnet.ca on Tuesday afternoon and Wednesday. Mark Spector had a Q&A with their GM, Bill Guerin.
Nice.
So maybe he can shed some light on
right.
the thought process. I know it was reported on the headlines last weekend that he's not going to be rushing to do anything, nothing emotional, which makes a lot of sense, right? He's just inherited this team. But
wouldn't you love to hear a GM come in and say, I'm going to get crazy. I'm just going to act
blowing
on
it up.
raw emotion. But yes, of course. I mean, at some point it becomes too much to ignore there. And
they seem destined to do something.
They really do.
To turn down, like to go back down the standings and
see if you can rise up. Might as well go down while your division is absolutely the toughest in the league, and give it a few years. All right, well, we're not going to give it a few years here. We'll be back next week on the Tape to Tape podcast. Until then, you can always follow Rory on Twitter at Rory Boylan, myself at Dixon on Sports. Come by sportsnet.ca for all our coverage of hockey and every other sport. Some great stuff going on in the sports world right now. Check back next week for more glass rattling hockey action on Tape to Tape.